evening, everyone. I'm Chris Stover from the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs, and on behalf of CCEPA and the Canadian Business Ethics Research Network, or CBERN, I'd like to welcome you all here tonight, both our audience here at Acadia and our live stream audience. CCEPA and CBERN are very pleased to be here tonight, our very first collaboration with Acadia University. And for those of you who may not be familiar with CCEPA, it's an organization co-founded by St. Mary's University and the Atlantic School of Theology in Halifax. It's an organization with a mandate to provide an arena for critical thinking, public discussion, and research into current ethical challenges in our society. And we do this three ways: through public presentations, supporting research, and developing ethical frameworks for government organizations or any other sort of organization that needs that kind of help. Our public presentations are designed to facilitate informed choices through respectful debate on public issues, providing a balance of perspectives on a broad range of ethical concerns. Our co-sponsor for this evening's event, the Canadian Business Ethics Research Network, is an organization that mobilizes and profiles Canada's rich pool of business ethics expertise across disciplines and sectors and creates opportunity for dialogue and knowledge sharing. Headquartered in Toronto at York University, it's a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada knowledge cluster with an Atlantic hub, which calls itself its home at CCEPA. We're grateful also to have the support of the President's Office here at Acadia and that of Environmental and Sustainability Studies Professor Dr. Edith Callaghan as we gather together tonight to talk about ethics in development with a fine panel of discussants. I'm really looking forward to the range of perspectives that we'll hear tonight on this issue, both from our panel and from you, the audience, during the question period that will follow, and from our online audience as well through the chat feature on your screen. We're delighted to have the online participation. I'll encourage the online viewers as well to use the evaluation option on your screen to tell us what you think of tonight's event. For those of you in the room, we've provided paper copies. I'd really appreciate it if you could fill them out. Your thoughts and views on how we present these issues is very important in how we go ahead and plan future events, so that's valuable. There's also an information table as you leave and as you came in that has lots of information about CBERN and CCEPA. Please have a look, sign up for our newsletters, or have a look at other presentations that we've got coming along. There is also an array of DVDs out there of programs that CCEPA has presented in the past. If any of those spark your interest, by all means, take them home with you. Drop us an email if there's any there that you like and you'd like to see more of, and we can send you some copies of those. So now I'll hand things over to my colleague, Dr. Edith Callaghan, here at Acadia, who has been hugely instrumental in the development of tonight's event, so she can formally introduce our panelists. Thank you very much.
Just turning on there. Thank you, Chris. And welcome to everyone here and in our live stream audience. Thank you for making it out to this evening's panel discussion. This evening, our discussion will revolve around topics related to ethics in development. Of course, this is a broad and unwieldy subject area that could be examined from multiple perspectives. This evening, we will bound this topic with a focus on development in Nova Scotia from the perspectives of municipal and provincial policy, education, and immigration, and possibly other things that our panelists will throw into the mix as we go along. Together, we'll begin to examine how much and in what ways ethics plays part in our decision-making and planning in these areas. Our panelists for the evening, who I'll introduce shortly, have provided us with short summaries of how they'll frame their presentations this evening, and those are here in the handouts that we've given you. Also on this handout is a list of questions that we developed when we were planning this session, and these we provide to you simply to whet your appetite for interesting and engaged discussion. So feel free to look at these and ask these questions or your own questions as we go along. The format for this evening's discussion will be as follows. After I wrap up, I'll turn the presentation over to the panelists. Proceeding in alphabetical order, each panelist will present their perspectives on ethics and development for 3 to 5 minutes. After this, the panelists will have an opportunity to ask one another questions and to comment on each other's presentations and hopefully bring out some of the integrative nature of the comments that they're making here this evening. I'll just make a note that the panelists here, while they represent specific sectors, their comments here tonight are to be taken more as their opinion, not necessarily the opinions of the institutions they represent. After they wrap up their discussion for about 15 or 20 minutes, we'll open the discussion to the audience, to the live audience here and the online audience. And I invite members of our audience to ask questions that will carry us further into this discussion and help us understand more the nature of these complex issues that we're talking about tonight. And we will be wrapping up this session by 8:30 at the latest for those of you who have papers to write. So now I will introduce the speakers. Arthur Bull is a senior policy analyst for Nova Scotia Department of Policy and Priorities. He has been actively involved in rural community development for the past 25 years. Andy Fillmore has experience with the ethical dimensions of development through his recent past position as manager of urban design for the Halifax Regional Municipality and currently as director of the School of Planning at Dalhousie University. Ray Ivany, president of Acadia University, has a long history of leadership and community involvement through many facets of his work, including his work as president of Nova Scotia Community College and as an advisor on many regional and national government advisory councils. And Elizabeth Mills is executive director of the Nova Scotia Office of Immigration. She has opportunities to engage in ethical decision-making on a daily basis in her strive to balance the objectives of Nova Scotia economic development with the needs of new immigrants. So without further ado, I will turn it over to our panelists, and we will start with Arthur.
Thanks, Edith, and thanks, Chris, for the invitation. It's really been a very wonderful opportunity to reflect on this. From my point of view, I've spent my working life involved in community development, ranging from inner city settings to remote rural settings. I live on Digby Neck, but I work in downtown Halifax. I've also worked on a provincial policy point of view, but also I've been the chair of the Coastal Communities Network for about 5 years. So I've looked at this from a lot of points of view, and this has given me an opportunity to reflect on this question of ethics and development. So it's more in the nature of a personal reflection rather than an announcement from the provincial government. Others do that better than I do. I first was struck in thinking about this that there's an extraordinary range of narratives about development in Nova Scotia, depending on where you stand. For example, for any given project, I won't name any specific ones because I don't want to get us down that path, but at one end you can have a narrative which is about industrial development, creating jobs, keeping youth in communities, bringing in investment and diversifying the economy. So Project X looks pretty good from that point of view. Primarily an urban point of view, actually, but also a provincial point of view, looking at the broad public good. The very same project, locally, can look very, very different. It can look like a very harsh process of intimidation, sometimes litigation, sometimes vilification in the press if you oppose it, and a range of very high-pressure tactics locally. The very same project in this little province looks that different. So this really got me thinking about this question. What are we talking about here? And what I started to realize is that these different points of view are really grounded in different ethical worldviews, different points of view, and different narratives about what kind of society we want. So I started thinking about what is the range, because it's not just these 2 points of view. There's really a whole range of different perspectives, and each one of those has an ethical underpinning, or if you want, an ideological point of view about how the world should be and what kind of Nova Scotia we want. So you have that primarily urban and provincial point of view about the greater good, which is essentially kind of a utilitarian point of view. That is, the most good for the most people, right? So that's the overriding thing we're looking at. That's how we measure public policy and development. And so from that point of view, we measure development according to benefit to the most number of people. Another urban point of view, similar in that it's utilitarian, is primarily, I don't want to say it's exclusively urban, but largely urban, is primarily environmental in the sense of looking at the broader public good, the longer range questions about climate change, about diversity, biodiversity, about endangered species. So there is an urban point of view which takes that look at it, but in many cases is opposed to development of natural resources, particularly industrial development. So if we move into a rural setting, then we have, these are caricatures, by the way. I realize people don't really fit exactly into these categories, but I'm trying to sort out these different narratives. Though there's a narrative which often gets characterized as not in my backyard or NIMBY, and that is might typically be people who have invested in a lifestyle, living in a rural area, have planned their lives, and this has been somewhat disrupted by development. And sometimes these people aren't people who are used to having their rights violated, and so sometimes become very effective advocates of in opposition to a particular development project. Another really important category, and a very large category, is actually people engaged in the local rural economy, which in Nova Scotia, in many, many cases, is a small business owner-operator, sometimes artisanal economy. So these folks are basically saying, we have an economy here. We resist another economy being superimposed on it, another version of our economy. So this is about local small business economies. A typical example would be the lobster fishery in Nova Scotia, which just opened, which is worth over $500 million to this province, almost entirely family-owned artisanal businesses. And so those folks would point to, for instance, the area with the highest GDP in Europe, in northern Italy, around Emilia-Romagna, around Bologna, which is entirely an artisanal owner-operator economy with large cooperative sector. So that's a pretty big cohort. And then finally, there's another narrative, which may not be as big in numbers, but is a very powerful critique of development. And this could be characterized as sort of a deep ecology point of view. And this might be informed in some cases by traditional First Nations people, in Mi'kmaq culture, informed by the principle Natukalimp, which is about the reciprocity of reciprocal relations between nature and society. And but also groups like Transition Towns and so forth, who are really, they have a narrative about development that says this is really an extension of colonialism, that this is about state-subsidized industrial monopolies extracting wealth, and that they would oppose that in favor of a very much local economy. So I'm giving you really caricature versions of these different narratives. The point I want to make, though, is each one of those narratives is grounded in a very different worldview, whether it be utilitarian, whether it be communitarian, or whether it be a deep ecology kind of point of view. And what that tells me is that we need spaces in Nova Scotia for public deliberation. We are very weak in that area. I think we could say our political institutions for representative democracy are relatively healthy by international standards. Our political representation and that system works well. When it comes to participatory democracy, I think we're very much weaker. We lack spaces for having conversations between people who are coming to these questions from very, very different world views. And I think that's the real challenge that we face on this question of ethics in development. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Arthur. Andy?
All right. Thank you. Thanks, Edith, and thanks, Chris, for the invitation. And I'm so pleased to be back at my old alma mater, and now, as then, nobody sitting in the front row. I think some things are universal. So I wanted to bring this to a place of physical development, city planning, urban design, and growth. So the way I'll frame this, there's a little write-up in the program that talks about a specific project, but I'm going to sort of build on that a little bit as well. So about 3 years ago, a major downtown plan was adopted for Halifax. It was called HRM by Design, and there was about 4 years of very hard work, extensive public engagement that led up to that plan. And Arthur said that we don't do engagement as well as we can in Nova Scotia. And I think we were trying to change some of that with that project. We really did it in a very in-depth way. The planners working on that project were constrained by a set of professional ethics, a code of conduct, really, that had three major pieces. One is responsibility to the public interest, responsibility to the profession of planning and its integrity, and responsibility to our client or employer, which was, in this case, was the municipality. And if you extend that, then they're really the people of the city as well, their citizens. That was adopted, and at its heart was this intent about drawing intensification, density, and development into the urban core of not just the city of Halifax, but really, frankly, competing with other areas of the province for population and for growth. And that was a kind of what I feel is there's an element of a kind of a moral response there that says we're entering a stage in the history of the Earth where there is great competition for energy. Energy prices are out of control. There's environmental degradation. Energy prices are escalating rapidly. And we've built a kind of a network of communities and infrastructure that supports them, hard infrastructure like roads and pipes, and soft infrastructure like schools and galleries and restaurants even, recreation centers, that as the cost of energy and the cost of providing public services continues to escalate, those networks are going to be unsustainable in the sort of extent, to the extent that they are managed right now. So the plan was very much about that, about bringing development into a more dense and therefore fundamentally sustainable model. The Sky Halifax application came along in this calendar year and in a number of ways challenged the downtown plan. It wanted to build a building, two towers actually, that were 2.6 times taller than the downtown plan permitted. So the plan said about 23 stories was reasonable, and the project was for 48 stories. And there were 4 or 5 other places where it challenged the plan as well. So the challenge here is, what do you do? I mean, we recognize that we want to densify, but we also recognize that we have a democratically adopted plan that thousands and thousands of residents put a lot of time and energy into, and that a council dutifully adopted through a democratic process. So there was a role for staff there to defend the plan, to defend that democratic process. On the other hand, the councillors felt there was a role there to defend democracy by taking this proposal to another public hearing and letting the public have their say. So the two things that were at play here were, do you follow the well-established plan, or do you let the community sort of battle it out on a building-by-building process? So that was complicated. When we submitted these topics to Edith and Chris, council hadn't made a decision on this particular project. Earlier this week they did, and they voted to stop the project. So the plan was upheld. And I think most planners and a lot of the people who spend a lot of time involved with the plan felt that that was a great day for democracy and a great day for the city. There were also a lot of people who felt that we lost a big opportunity to densify the urban core and to become more efficient. So those are the ethical challenges to do with physical development, one at a sort of macro level of the plan and what the plan's trying to do on a kind of a provincial scale about drawing population away from outlying areas, and then at a micro scale about a specific application that kind of illustrated those challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Ray?
Great, thanks, Edith. Look, I'm going to come at this with a bit of a framework that's not Nova Scotia specific at all, although I'll freely admit a bias growing up in Cape Breton, which felt pretty colonial during my times, with most of the industry controlled by absentee landlords and the resources of the community being used. And in the next phase of development, really the classic case of companies arriving, attracted on a footloose basis by some sort of incentive, and when the incentive ran out, they left. So I bear the scars of that, and I suspect we'll end up having some conversation about Nova Scotia specifically. But look, I felt honor-bound given the topic, and I freely admit ethics is a well-recognized and established branch of moral philosophy, and I am neither an ethicist or a philosopher. But I'll try to pay respect to at least my undergraduate education in philosophy to say the ethical questions that we're dealing with here, I think, are problematic at a variety of levels. And I want to try to illustrate the problems before suggesting perhaps a way of dealing with it. I think whenever we use the word, and we often use the word ethics and morals or a moralistic approach almost synonymously, I think inaccurately when we do so. But even when we raise it from a straightforward perspective, we're often talking about sort of ethics as virtues, right? So we're talking about, sort of the highest expression of character, and what kind of person would I be if I did X or Y, and in fact, that's absolutely fine. I think that is a well-established ethical framework, which is exceedingly easy to pass judgment on in the black and the white, exceedingly difficult to pass judgment on in the multiple shades of gray in between. So if that is not particularly effective, and I think Arthur and Andy have already given you enough of a frame that most of the time, I believe, when we're talking about applying ethics to development questions, we are not talking about a clear choice between good and evil. We are often talking about choices between two goods or choices between two bad options, and which one is less bad. So we are immediately thrown into the realm of a degree of relativism, which any of the philosophy students in the room will know does not lend itself well to any kind of binary ethical decision-making. So we need to look to other realms. Again, Arthur touched on actually two that I think are partially useful. One is kind of a utilitarian approach, which I think really calls into question what produces the most good or the least harm. But again, another forced choice that doesn't give us absolute clarity on either side, and often depends on the perspective and the lens through which you are looking. The other is, and this has been around since the Greeks, has been the exploration of the common good and the intrinsic value in a common good that transcends in many ways the individual expression of good. And that immediately throws us again into what I am suggesting is a complicated application of ethics with respect to development. Now, again, you're all reading the same newspapers that I am. I'm not talking about the construction industry in Quebec, right? I mean, there I think we can see some very clear lines in terms of ethical behavior, but it's not a matter of one path being ethically pure or right even if people are being honest and acting with integrity, the decisions force you to make choices. Again, I thought Arthur's example was particularly effective in this, that you can still be honest, acting with integrity, consistent in terms of a set of values, and still end up with significant polarities in terms of how we make these decisions. So I'm led to, again, it's interesting, the three of us so far, and I'm sure Elizabeth will do the same, coming at this from slightly different perspectives, but really searching around for an answer in the same place. And where I go is a robust process that allows, and this is probably a more communitarian view, but a robust process that allows a collective to weigh those very fine shades of gray and those nuances and those multiple perspectives. I mean, it really is, any of those classic examples of, looking at a multidimensional object from different sides, you see different things. But providing a robust process that allows for those views, those multiple views, to be heard, to be respected, to be held, usually for longer than we do in democratic decision-making processes. And I'd ask the audience to reflect on, think of our dissatisfaction with the kinds of decision-making structures that we have. Whether that's formal political and democratic processes, whether it's decision-making that's made in your community, and there's a reason for, I think, our dissatisfaction. And it often relates to someone does not feel heard, or to go back to another ethical frame for this, it's sort of the Aristotelian notion of treating equals equally. Well, if you are party to a process and do not feel that you are an equal member of that process, I think fundamentally your engagement probably goes down, but certainly your satisfaction with outcome, at least any time I felt like that, I've never been satisfied with the outcome regardless of even agreement with the ultimate decision. So I think the process question, and I'll kind of close on that, the process question, I think, leads us to a couple of places, and it's more than just consultation. Often it is as simple as assembling the facts that impinge on the decision. Again, if we can't get agreement that all the facts are on the table, we likely have a bias built into the process from the outset. Again, if we have groups that feel that they're there as unequals, I don't think you can get to an ethical or a fair outcome. If we don't examine multiple alternatives, this is one that's perhaps a personal bugbear. I mean, one of the things that really troubles me about this kind of decision-making that we're talking about is any group, including, and I could be party to this, getting locked on to a particular path that delimits the potential outcomes, again, early in the process, because you're now excluding those that hold alternative views. You have to reconcile the alternative views. I think we need to carry them later into the process before we try to ultimately winnow them down. Whereas most of our processes, democratic and otherwise, and especially in partisan politics, of course, what they do is they segment those very, very early on, and the debate often is about what alternative gets traction and is held. The last piece, which, and I'll just do this quickly and finish off my opening comments, is that I think we need almost a proxy or a close approximation of a final decision before we have a final decision, so that we get an opportunity to hold up the result of a process when it's right at the point, before it's solidified, to allow that almost sober second thought of all those that have participated and whether it stands scrutiny. And the last piece, I don't think things are over when one implements. Again, if we're talking about some sort of ethical, and I'm now skating into grounds of just, I think, fairness, And that is, if we implement the result of these processes, no matter how efficacious, how meritorious the outcome, without subjecting that decision to some level of scrutiny and evaluation post hoc. Because if you think about the amount of investment we put into decisions, particularly big decisions that we care about, we put a tremendous amount of energy into making the decision. We put very, very little energy. In fact, people usually disperse and we don't look back. We don't really reflect. We don't learn from that, which may be one of the reasons why we keep doing it again and again. So my last comment quickly is just, it seems to me that the process questions around openness, transparency, the ability to participate fully and equitably as a partner at least gives us a greater opportunity to engage in difficult decision-making within an ethical frame.
Thank you, Ray. Elizabeth.
Canada is seen to be one of the best countries in the world to immigrate to by many, many people. And there are over 100,000 visas issued each year for people to come to Canada, come as visitors, come as temporary foreign workers, come as international students. And of that 100,000, or 1 million visas, 260,000 people get permanent resident status each year. So Canada grants 265,000 people every year immigration status to Canada. So that's quite significant. In fact, Canada receives more immigrants per capita than the United States. And the policy of Canada is that we have a balance of immigration and that we also have a very humanitarian policy that we invite refugees and persons who need protection to Canada. Again, Canada receives the largest number of refugees and protected persons per capita than any other country in the world. So immigration is a trend that is happening in Canada. A wonderful woman called Ruth Goldblum, who's recently passed away, would do a little test in this room now. And she would ask for all the people in this room who are immigrants to stand up. Maybe put your hands up instead of standing up. Okay. All of you who are international students, put your hands up. Keep your hands up, please. Okay. All of you who are first-generation Canadians, put your hands up. Keep your hands up if you have it. Okay. All of you whose grandparents immigrated here. Okay. So at the end of this process, almost everybody in this room has their hand up. Canada is a country of immigration, and we are going through a phenomenal change right now in Canada. There is a debate going on as to whether or not our immigration policy should be about nation building. Should it be about nation building, or should it be about feeding the need for workers, feeding businesses' needs for workers? So there is a real debate that's going on. The other thing that I'd like to pose is that there are many people who want to come to Canada for very extreme reasons. Most people do not want to leave their home country, but there are many people who seek Canada for refuge, for safety, for a future for their families, for a better economic future. And those people sometimes are prey to unethical immigration consultants and lawyers. And they're often provided with misinformation, and they are paying exorbitant fees and are actually put in a very vulnerable position. So you may hear things like people being smuggled into Canada in container boats. You may hear about people who come as refugee claimants. You may hear about people that marry Canadians for the purposes of getting citizenship or getting immigration status and eventually citizenship. So immigration can be really a range of people who come to Canada with the best intent and may have been misled by unethical immigration consultants. So that is another area where they are vulnerable. They come here and they're in a vulnerable position. And then when we look at those people in the host country, those of us who have been in Canada for a while, what are our motives in accepting immigrants? And if you talk to people, most Canadians support immigration. And again, that is unlike many countries in the world. Many countries in the world, the public do not support immigration, but it is so in Canada. And probably because most of the people in this room would put up their hand in some status or other of recent immigration. But when I talk to Nova Scotians, for example, I'm very interested to hear that many Nova Scotians are interested in immigrants coming here, not for the purposes of what immigrants can bring to add to the diversity and to add to the outward mobility and the innovation and the competitiveness and the creativity that all of that brings to this province, but for the purposes of attracting immigrant investment money. So I remind people that immigrants are people. And we, as the host society, must look at ways that we can truly welcome and engage newcomers. Nova Scotia is a province that is very welcoming, very hospitable to tourists, but are we really engaging immigrants and bringing them in as members of our family and our community and fully involving them in the decisions that need to be made to advance our society and our communities? So there are a lot of ethical decisions. It was mentioned that I deal with those decisions every day, and I'm going to give you one example. I was approached by a community group, and they're very interested in bringing in investment capital from immigrants to advance their community. This is a very remote community in Nova Scotia, and it has been steadily depopulated. It is mostly a fishing community. Tourism was the other main industry, and that has been falling down as well. So they'd like to bring in some immigrant investment capital to build up some other sectors and diversify the economy. And they'd also like to bring in some families. So I had the pleasure to meet a young couple from China. And here is a husband and wife, and their English is very poor. And this community group wants them to go to this very remote community where the family probably has very little likelihood of succeeding. So whether it's an ethical issue or a moral issue, do I nominate this family to go to a community that I know the likelihood is that they will not be successful? They will not have a good opportunity for making a living, and they may not be really welcomed in that community. So these are some of the issues, the ethical issues that our Office of Immigration deals with on a regular basis. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is open the floor to our panelists to ask questions of one another or comment, maybe bringing together some of the streams of discussion that I've seen floating around the tables here.
Well, thank you, Edith. I'll take a crack at that. I'll bring it back to my area of expertise, which is physical planning again. I was really struck by Ray's, and Arthur talked about it a little bit as well, description of binary choice, and where are the shades of gray in the dialogue. Binary positions can emerge very quickly on major issues of community development, and not much good comes of that. The richness and advancement of the community really comes in the discussion that happens between the poles, not at the poles. And what we found, to put that into perspective with this plan that I was talking about, what we found when we were writing the plan was that prior to its adoption, we were sort of participating in the same old polarized debate. The plan stood for, people would say, growth and change, and the folks who were against the plan were for preservation and quietude. Did I make that word up? Quietude, is that a word? It's a good word. Okay.
You're talking about HRM by design.
HRM
right?
by design,
yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So once the plan was adopted and development started to happen, because we had a plan that people understood, the polarized debate stopped, and projects would get approved because they conformed to the plan. And projects were good projects, and they brought community benefit like housing and streetscape improvements. But suddenly a single project that did not conform to that plan took us right back to that place of polarization. And the community, once again, for the first time in 3 or 4 years, became deeply polarized about a development issue. So that really resonated when you were talking about that. And what we need to strive for in this, in wrestling this, is that rich debate in the middle, the shades of gray.
I guess very much along the same lines, one of the underlying themes I thought I heard was about choice, and about not just freedom to choose this or that option, but actually informed choice. And it made me think about this other alternative to the utilitarian kind of view, which I think sometimes is called capability theory. There's a writer named Amartya Sen and a philosopher named Martha Nussbaum have written a lot about this and developed a critique of sort of this utilitarian point of view. And so it's really not about saying what people should do, what the right course of action is. It's about the capability of people to make a choice. In other words, you have the right to vote, but if you don't have transportation to get to the polls, if you can't read the campaign literature and so forth, then that right is empty. You don't have the capability. So this idea that Ray talked about getting all the facts, all the information out there, and also all the options, to me that's about the capability. In the end, people will choose. And it's not up to policy analysts to make that choice. It's not up to the state to make that choice. But it is up to us to ensure that people have the capability to make that informed choice. So I find that a very interesting theme. And in terms of the choices we have around immigration or around planning, to me, there seems to be a really interesting avenue there that we should explore more, as opposed to saying which is the right or wrong course from today's perspective. So I just that seemed to be an underlying theme.
I want to throw something in here, and in relation to things that everybody has really said here, and the question about choice and having the facts in front of you. Some of my students will recognize when I say the brutal facts in front of you. How do we know when we have all the facts, and what do you do in situations where there's one camp maybe responding from a position of fear, saying, those are not the right facts, or those are misleading facts, or you're not giving us all the facts, and then you get the further entrenchment. So how do you work from a position like that? And maybe from HRM by design, you encountered that, or...
Well, at the risk, I don't want to consume too much time here with this, but with this project, but that project played out in the newspaper every day for 3 years, and it was just exactly what you're talking about. One side sort of claiming that the other side was misrepresenting the facts in some way, and really it's a mug's game. You get into that debate publicly, and there's really no way to win it other than to just sort of turn your books inside out and let everybody see everything that you've gathered and all the research that you've done and the comments that you've heard from everybody. I don't know what the answer to that one is yet, other than transparency.
I think it's a good question, though, because there are some cases where we can get the facts out there, and there are some, at the risk of sounding like a government apologist. I mean, when Minister Steele came out and said, here's the books in black and white, and here's the choices. That was something that, I mean, people could argue about what to do about it, but the facts were there. If you move into another area like fracking, or I can name any other, the actual scientific data is in question, and that's tough. Then you have to say, what is a fact? Mm-hmm. You have to go a little bit beyond a scientific fact and look at what kind of world do we want to live in. That's also something that needs to be on the table. What are like Ray talked about, all the alternatives, the options. Let's look at those and talk about them before we go into the trenches.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't think there is a magic bullet. I think the transparency and openness theme is one that we likely are going to come back to over and over again, but there will be times when that's not sufficient to render the kind of clarity that you would like around a difficult decision, and whether it's something where the scientific base is still inconclusive, or whether take another change in Nova Scotia. Whether the Cobequid Pass or any of the major 100 series highways that have bypassed towns, you would have very different views of the merits of that initiative if you were talking about the efficiency of transportation versus the preservation of local economies. So I actually, I mean, if you can get that kind of stark clarity, and again, to your point, Edith, it's some trust that what you're dealing with is real, I think there's a lot to commend the democratic process at that stage. I think, I'm sort of the Churchillian view is that, democracy is a lousy system compared to all the other alternatives. It's, at some point, you need, and I think that's why we've built them as a society. I think we've built these democratic processes not to make the easy decisions, because frankly, you wouldn't need them. You'd have a consensus view. But to deal with them when, in fact, you do have a certain intractability. Now, that's not at all, I think I was clear in my first comment, that's not at all to be used as an excuse for not aspiring to and hopefully building processes that get us to many more decisions by something approximating consensus. I think sometimes we just move too quickly to, again, ready for the question, call for the vote, whether you do it in a legislature or whether you do it in a community hall. That, I think, is something that I don't think works. And so we need to pursue something better. The other point I'd make here, I mean, at one level, we're all privileged to live in a country like Canada, a province like Nova Scotia, and to be talking about these decisions oftentimes among competing goods. I mean, it's funny, I was struck in the conversation of thinking about, some of the development philosophers, perhaps more radical. Think of Paulo Freire in Brazil, and a notion of education really fundamentally being about liberation, right? So in other words, having the capacity as a society to participate not in a tremendous power imbalance, and he was talking about the masses that were exploited, but in some more of a level playing field. So that's the other dimension I'd go back to again, Edith. I think any time you try to engage in decision-making on development questions and the playing field is obviously, or perhaps not so obviously tilted, I think you have very, very low probability of getting to a decision that binds. I mean, I am curious, actually, because I watched HRM by Design from a distance, but, Andy's observations about, within the process, how do you stop even, a participatory process like that from becoming politicized? Because if the process becomes politicized, the outcome becomes tainted. So anyway, more questions than answers.
Andy, do you want to speak back to that?
Oh, no, just that it was entertaining at one point during that process that there was a provincial election and a mayoral election. So we got a premier elected during that time and a mayor, and all candidates were vying to support the plan. So it was politicized, but in an unexpected way.
And just to add a quick anecdote, talk about Paulo Freire. The new head of the Coady Institute, John Gaventa, whose area is participatory research, brought a guy named Pedro Pontual here, who's the advisor to the president of Brazil, and he talked to some of us. And he was a colleague of Freire's, and they basically are putting those principles into place. In Brazil, they have village councils, neighborhood councils, county councils, provincial, and they even have nationals in parallel to their representative democracy. But what he said was so interesting, because civil servants sit on those councils too, and citizens. And he said the civil servants have to give up some power to go in there, because these are not consultative, they're not advisory bodies. They make decisions about things like that. But he said, so do the community people. They have to give up some. So giving up power is an interesting thing that we don't do very often on purpose. So anyway, it's just an interesting reflection about how some of this may be developed, because I think Nova Scotia is really made for that kind of participatory process if we are willing to make it.
Do you say that because of the size of the province or the history of the province? What is it about us that make it ripe for that?
The size, the history, the diversity, the traditions we have going back to Cody and before, going back to the Acadians who had a very sort of communitarian decision-making process. I mean, not to romanticize it, because we've got lots of good conflict as well to resolve. But no, I think, I don't know, it could be wishful thinking, but I actually think we're better positioned to do this than lots of jurisdictions.
We're generally quite polite with each other.
And I would add, you know, learning from some things that haven't worked in our province. I mean, you know, we had a history which, you know, with colonial, neo-colonial, however you wish to describe it, that wasn't particularly effective. We've had the footloose industry, never-ending cycle of arrival and departure that, you know, saps vitality and energy from our community. So I think one of the things I'm optimistic as well in terms of our province on this issue we're discussing. But part of, I think, what drives us perhaps towards finding some more powerful, if not solutions, than processes that proceed in that direction, is because we've felt the sting of some things that just haven't worked for us, and we're still less than 1 million people, spread over a complicated geography, but still just having less than 1 million people within a sort of a nation-state structure, if you like, gives us some opportunities.
Okay, well, before I turn it over to the audience, I want to ask one more question, coming back to this question of imbalance, which I think is really quite critical. And particularly in relation to immigration, because there is a position, I think, where the playing field is particularly imbalanced. So I ask this question of Elizabeth, but also any of you could chime in. Really, how do we welcome immigrants to Nova Scotia and provide the possibility that the playing field can be somewhat level for them, or at least that but without bringing them into ours, but keeping them as immigrants with their own identity, if you know what I'm saying.
I'm going to tell you a story. When the Office of Immigration was opened in 2005, at the Christmas time, we decided we would have a party, and we would invite a lot of people. You may even have joined that very first party that we had. And we had about 250 people come to our open house. And we had decided that we would call it a Seasons Celebration Open House. And coming to that event were Nova Scotians, were politicians, were community leaders, academic leaders, and there were a lot of immigrants who came to that celebration. And so about a week later, I got a call from one of the ladies who invited me to an event at one of their homes. And they lived in Bedford and lived in one of the condominiums there. And in this building was a party room. So I went into the party room, and there were a number of women there who were all Muslim women, and they wore their hijab in public. So I walked into the room, and there was a Christmas tree there, and the Christmas tree was decorated. There was Christmas music playing, and there were Christmas presents under the tree, and there was a turkey cooking in the kitchen. So when the door closed and the music went on, and we did belly dancing and all sorts of, had a good time. And after all of that, when we were sitting to eat, the lady who had invited me to the event had said, "We really appreciate that you held that event, but we don't want you to give up the celebration of Christmas. We know that it's a sort of liberal thing to do, that, it becomes a season's holiday, that there are different religions, and you don't want to offend anyone. But we came to Canada to be Canadians, and we ask that you celebrate your holidays with us, and we invite you to celebrate our holidays with them." So their point here was to make that they don't want Canada to lose what we celebrate, but rather to gain what they bring as well. So I think that is an example that hit me right in the face of the importance of balance.
Thank you.
I approach it, I guess, just from the other angle, Edith, more from the richness of diversity when, in fact, there's a mutual respect and a sense of shared values. I mean, I think this university that we're gathered in tonight is probably a great example of that. For anybody that doesn't know, Acadia will, this year will draw students from every province and territory in Canada and 47 different countries. So it's a microcosm of the world. The power of it is that just from a pure academic excellence perspective, and, I see Dr. Herman in the audience, my colleague, we've had this conversation several times. I don't think Acadia could be as excellent as it is academically without that diversity. So there's an element of if you can actually create a space for people of diverse backgrounds and perspectives, since again we're still talking about how to reconcile those, but the richness that flows from that, if in fact you can create that climate of mutual respect and some sense of community, is just so, it's huge. I mean, again, in our case, I think it goes right to the core of who we are. So there's if you can get there, there are challenges to get there, as Elizabeth noted, but if you can get there, the returns are significant.
I think this idea of creating those spaces is really a critical one to this discussion. Again, we're into storytelling, but at one point, about 12 years ago, after the Marshall decision, the Supreme Court decision about the First Nation fishery, there was a lot of conflict in our area where I live, and we ended up doing something called dialogue dinners, and the first one was hosted at Bear River First Nation, and we invited the African Nova Scotian community, the what I call loyalist Anglo community, however you want to call that, British Isles, and the Acadian community from Clare. And we went around, actually each community would host a different dinner. They took turns. And it was amazing. But what was really incredible is people talking about their history. To hear people talk about slavery, or to talk about the genocide in the 18th century of the Mi'kmaq people, or to talk about the deportation, as if they were talking like it was the Vietnam War. But people had not heard each other's stories before. So this question of diversity is not just about immigrant communities. It certainly is. We also have work to do here. We have lots of diversity in Nova Scotia, but we also have lots and lots of separation. So when that happens, it's the most powerful thing I've ever experienced. It's just so amazing, and it means you can aspire to all kinds of different options about the future.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, panelists. I would like to open discussion to the audience now, and particularly encourage people of the under 30 generation to get up, and I think that you have a whole new way of communicating with each other that is frankly quite beyond me, and so maybe you could teach us something. So from the online audience or the live audience here, any questions for the panel?
Yesterday I came back from the United Kingdom, having spent a month there, and interviewed a number of people, mainly in Scotland, one in Wales, and they were arm's length people funded largely by government and struggling with major government cutbacks. And so I was very sympathetic with them and wondering how they were going to cope and try to do their job. But then last week, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, David Cameron, proclaimed that he would cut away all the, or almost all, of the planning and development regulations in order to stimulate economic development. So my question is really about, it struck me as an intergenerational equity problem here, and that if we create jobs now, we're going to create problems in the future. So I'm not sure how many shades of grey we have here, but I'm wondering how we can reconcile economic hardship in the present with future generations and how we're able to deal with that particular issue.
So that has obviously physical development overtones. Did you mean to say that David Cameron was talking about repealing physical development guidelines? That's fascinating. That's okay. Green belts, okay. So this idea of creating economic growth, stimulating economic growth in the right way and in the right places is topical everywhere, of course. And there are lots of ways to do it. That's an amazingly large step to take. The difficulty might be that you're then creating significant problems for future generations to contend with. Loss of green space, for example, expensive infrastructure. I'm just going to have to absorb that one for a minute. That's phenomenal.
Arthur, do you want to?
Just going to say it's a really great question, and one that Nova Scotia is facing right now, all across the board. Okay, so pick an example. Pick forestry, for example. You know, I have friends who say, look, it just like let the mills go. Let's get on with it. The next thing, you know, that's a lot of mortgages. That's a lot of households. The state's job is to look after people the best it can. You can't just say, we're moving on, we're going to pull the plug and go on. On the other hand, this intergenerational question raises an ethical question. What about forestry in 50 years? What's it going to look like? And so I think this is into the area of the gray area. How do we get away from that binary switch, on-off switch, and start thinking about, okay, we're going to have to think about complexity, right? It's not just an on-off thing. We're dealing with complexity here. So maybe that means we have to meet in different ways. Maybe we have to think about some new ways of having conversations. And again, the younger generation is going to lead on this, right? About using different media, and I really look forward to that. But that's about complexity. And we just have to, rather than fear complexity, we have to say that's the only way we're going to actually deal with those questions.
I would think that there would be legislation to change and regulations to change and bylaws to change. And I would think that there are some processes by which citizens would be engaged in that dialogue. So I don't think it would be as simple as him to proclaim all of that. I think that changes, you know, that sort of process would have to be followed. But I would agree with Arthur, and we had a discussion about this earlier. I think we really need to engage the youth in this discussion and in the discussion about immigration as well. We have a bit of a situation where we have high unemployment rates among youth, and we have a highly educated young population, but we have very high unemployment rates. So I think we really need to give way to have young people more involved and with greater power, greater say about some of these decisions that will impact them and impact us as we get older as well.
Just quickly, because someone waiting, but I mean, to take another dimension of a really complex example, Glenn, right off the bat, it really does underscore the structures that we have and the relative imbalances between those making the decisions and those on the receiving end of the decisions. And it seems to me that, you know, whether you're talking about, you know, Brazil on that level of reform, but that old adage of trying to drive the decision making as close as possible to those that are affected by it, regardless again of the individual decision made, is always going to produce something at least less traumatic than having, you know, work happening on the ground that gets trumped by a national or provincial government. So, I mean, I think it underscores the power imbalance issue.
Zach, we'll get to you in just one sec. I have a online question here that I will ask. So, a utilitarian view of HRM by design. How can we determine if this is in the greater good or not?
Well, Ray mentioned that your words were great, and I wrote them down here somewhere. It's this thing about the post hoc sorting out. So it's about measuring and recording and auditing what happened and what the impact of the work was. That particular plan, HRM by Design, is 3 years old. And one sort of quick metric about that is that there's been more development activity in downtown Halifax in those 3 years than in the previous 25 years combined. So that's a pretty compelling metric. But 3 years into a plan, it's early to take an accurate pulse. It's going to take a longer time to see what the true impacts are. And of course, doing that is written right into that plan, so that it's not concealed in any way.
You mean in terms of the feedback and
yeah,
reflection piece?
Reflection, mandatory 5-year review and 10-year review. In fact, the 10-year review got written into some provincial legislation, so we'll be certain to do that.
I was just wondering, when you were talking about openness and having all the facts, I was wondering like where the facts were coming from, like who's giving you these facts, and if there's a bias on the facts, and if you're getting the good and the bad, like both sides of the story, like when you were talking about the towers being built, like where were these facts coming from, and were they like the good and the bad? Like was one side giving the good, or did you have to like dig for the facts?
Because it was an application made to the city, it was really the applicant's job to make their case. Really, is what it came down to make a case. The role of the city was to help the council to understand what existing planning documents said, what their intent was, and the impact that they've been having. So in a way, the city who was I'll make it a little more personal. The city planners who were attempting to defend the plan were really doing so with one or perhaps both arms tied behind their back. There was no PR mechanism available, no bully pulpit in that way to sort of counteract the position being put forward by the applicant. So that was rather difficult. And in that kind of a situation, you really kind of have to rely on the strength of the plan, strength of the document, which is like a contract, I guess you'd say, between residents and the community, and on good deliberative decision making by the community's representatives on council.
I guess just to add a short comment on that, I think this also points to the importance of institutions like this one. If universities have to be independent centers of knowledge, right? And it's just there's a critical role of the research community in doing that. And I know that's a fraught question. There's lots of issues around that, but to me, we need to be able to look with some trust to these knowledge centers to say, you're independent, aren't you? Right? If we don't have that, then I think we're in trouble.
I would agree. Just a quick process is a great question. A quick process piece. I think I have been involved at a more micro level than what we're talking here, but institutionally or otherwise, where one of the first steps you do is get agreement on the fact base, right? And all the parties. So it's not one party presenting their facts and another party presenting theirs, but a collective process where you get an agreement that at least that's solid ground, that we can agree on that, and then the disagreements at least, again, get pushed later, which is something that I'll continue to advocate for, is holding on to multiple alternatives longer in the process, in my mind, makes it a better process, where you start streaming them out early, and then they fall by the wayside. Anybody that felt like their alternative fell by the wayside before it was given adequate consideration, you've lost them as part of the process.
Thank you. Colin, you were next up.
I'll try, and I might kind of do a roundabout way to asking the question because there's a lot of stuff that kind of pertain to it. I'll frame it kind of in Andy's situation with the buildings. You have all this talk about capability to make decisions, and all about the utilitarian, the greater good. How do you know you have everyone voting in the best interests of the most people, or the interests of the greater good, because that's who voted, and you go to this and you're talking about efficiency. You want to create density in these towers. I'm wondering, can you ever, or will we ever be able to take the choice away from people who aren't educated enough, who don't understand, or are refusing to change that way, who don't want to create more density, they don't want to be more efficient? We have a consumption problem. We will have a consumption problem. We're growing, right? I'm wondering, can we ever, and this may be more philosophical than anything, but can we ever take that decision away from people who aren't qualified to make that decision? And this is a little bit political, and it may resonate poorly with, democracy or however you want to say it, but the fact of the matter is a lot of people don't have the knowledge to make decisions that they have the ability to vote on. So I guess the question is, and I don't know if it's too abstract, but does anyone feel there will ever be a direction taken that takes that away from people who aren't qualified to do that?
That endpoint is very extreme, and there's a lot of spectrum along the way to get there. And what's on that spectrum, in my experience, is just working hard, doing your best to get information, make information available, and to talk about issues in an authentic way, and to work hard to create opportunities for authentic discussion about these important issues. I know exactly the point you're making, and it's a troubling one. You and your cohort and your children are going to be dealing with the things that we leave behind, and you want to control now. I understand that. In the context of democracy, the way that our kind of world is constructed right now, at least in Canada, it's hard to imagine exactly how that would manifest. So I would go back again to go to work on that spectrum of education and discussion and find your power there.
Yeah, I really agree with that perspective, but I think it's a really good question, right? It takes us to an important and sort of uncomfortable place about making the right decision. I think we already do that. I think we already exclude people quite a lot, right? We are already, government comes in with its expertise and its, sort of technocratic kind of, we know best. We do that all the time. That's been my experience. The challenge is, how do we change that? And one of the ways we change that is to recognize that there's different ways of knowing. There's not just one way of knowing. Often we have a history in this country of learning about indigenous knowledge and local ecological knowledge versus scientific knowledge. And now in this province, there's people from the Mi'kmaq background who are talking about two-eyed seeing, right? So two different ways of knowing. But it wasn't very long ago we said that's not a way of knowing, that's anecdotal. So we have a long way to go, but I think that question takes us to those ways of recognizing there are different ways of knowing. There's different knowledge. We have to figure out ways that they can connect. It's not easy. So I appreciate the question, though.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
The only other thing I would add is participation. We really don't have the voter turnout that we should have in this democracy and in this province and in this country. So we need more people to be participating in that process. So we need to have better ways to inform so that we can really understand what the question and the issue is. We need a broader debate so that all of those views are presented, but we need more people participating in the decision making.
Yeah, Colin, thanks for the question. Uncomfortable but important. At the other end of the spectrum, though, I'm not given to the cult of experts either, because their track record isn't that great, right? I mean, and so I think where I try to find some middle ground is to contextualize it, right? Is expertise, does it have a place? Absolutely. But I think it's important, whether it's, other groups, Indigenous or otherwise, or just people who live in places that are impacted by those decisions, right? There's voice that needs to be provided there. I mean, I think all of us are sufficiently disenchanted with, you know, the "I'm from Ottawa and I'm here to help you" approach on, you know, decisions made from afar. So.
All right, Chris.
Hello. So this is mainly an immigration question, but what would you say would be the best way to combine both the new immigrants, so the people who are studying here or have just come from either Europe or Asia or Africa, and sort of the older immigrants and the people who came a generation ago? And what would you say would be the best way to sort of combine the two groups into one Canada, be it sort of physical growth and try to build infrastructure that will bring them together, or combine them through education like with the dinners or some other method? So what would be the best way of doing that?
Well, first of all, Canada does have a policy of multiculturalism. So our policy differs from the United States, which is the melting pot perspective. So our approach in Canada is to celebrate that diversity. And I think that's a policy that I would support in Nova Scotia. It also goes to sort of what's in it for me. It's sort of not in my backyard is the other side of that equation, but what's in it for me? So when the host society looks to welcome immigrants to their province or their country, they look to what is the benefit to me and to our province. And for me, I see myself as a little old lady in a rocking chair in a senior's home, and I'd really like to have somebody looking after me. And so we're receiving a lot of immigrants from various countries to work in the healthcare sector. So pretty soon those people become very important to us. We become dependent on them. And I think that immigrants come to communities, they come to neighbors, and they come to cities. Cities and municipalities have initiated welcoming community initiatives so that immigrants feel more part of those communities. Recreation facilities are more welcoming to people of different religions and different cultures. But I think it also boils down to a personal responsibility. Each and every one of us has a responsibility and an opportunity and a privilege to welcome a newcomer to our community and to our neighborhood. So I think it's policy, it's communities, and it's individuals.
And building dense, walkable, vibrant communities for them to live in.
Okay, thank you. I can't remember who was next in line here. I'll come back over here. Connor?
Hello. I was just wondering, how would you say the relevance of ethics in Nova Scotian public affairs compares to, say, the rest of the country?
Fantastic. I say that because I want Nova Scotia to be a welcoming province for immigrants. So if they believe that we have ethical public policy processes, they will see Nova Scotia as a good place to be. So many immigrants do come here for that purpose, for freedom and for the ability to become involved in political activities and in decision making. So I would say excellent. Mm-hmm.
I'll just add to that, and I try to make this ring true, but I really mean it. I've been in government for a short time, about 3 years now, and I can tell you the public service in Nova Scotia is really amazing. There's a lot of really amazing people who are very serious about public service. You know, we've got maybe a public idea about civil servants and so forth, and we maybe expect the worst, but up close, I'm talking about people who are really ethical and who are really thinking about the right thing to do. And so I'll put in a plug. The public service of Nova Scotia is about to have a huge turnover. And it's a really interesting place to work. And you're involved with real stuff. And so my impression as a new person in government has been, I've been blown away by it, by the quality of people. Not just their skills but also the ethical stuff they're talking about.
Okay, good. Brett?
Hi, panel. I'm Brett. I'm a first-year student here. And my question is similar to one Colin asked earlier, except it's sort of in a different direction. So the Sky's the Limit project, it was canceled due to democracy, and that was considered a win for democracy. But what I'm wondering is, do you think democracy can sometimes interfere with the most ethical decision? Or the other way, do you think the best way to achieve ethical decision or ethics in development is through democracy?
Mr. President?
Well, you know what? I'll buy you some time. But you know the thing I'm struck by is we try to evaluate the merits of these decisions, however made. Remember in the 60s or 70s, the famous question that was posed to the then premier of China about what they thought of the French Revolution. And the response was, it's too early to tell. Right? I mean, there is something about the time frame around evaluating these decisions. We evaluate them at the point in time that they're made, when the real valuation of, even again, if we use the utilitarian notion, the real assessment of whether you've maximized the good or minimized the harm can't be made sometimes for decades or centuries in the future. So the time frame is something that I think is problematic in trying to think about whether you've even gotten to the quote-unquote right outcome.
And just to add to that, I don't know if I'm going to get the wording of this right, but there's this quote about democracy, including not only people who are alive now, but people who are dead and people who are not born yet. Like, think about that. And then if you go to the deep ecology people, they say, and also maybe other species as well. That would be interesting. So democracy, does it mean people who have the right to vote? Like in Athens, it was free men who were citizens, right? But they had a pretty good system for the time. But so how widely do we define democracy? And I don't know how you do that, but I just find it's an interesting concept to think about it in longer terms, but also who came before us, right?
What can I add, really? But to bring it back sort of to the local, there's the difference between democracy, the way it's practiced, and the definition of democracy, which is what you were just talking about. It's not hard to see that, in the last 6 months in the United States, for example, that although called democracy, it's a sort of a funny, pale imitation of it, where completely trivial matters are being debated on the national stage while the ice caps are melting and oil's running out. So those are the things that should be being discussed. People who are elected to represent the people are in a strong functioning democracy are meant to be debating what's important and making decisions on behalf of people. So from that perspective, I think democracy does get to ethical decision making if it's truly representative of the public good and the public belief. Then it does work that way. The last thing I'll say is I have a friend who's very interested in in creating more opportunities for people to make decisions and make contributions to the decisions that fundamentally affect their lives. The group has started is called Re-Demos, so sort of like to do democracy again, to bring it back. And he practices something called the art of hosting, or the art of hosting authentic conversations. And it's to do with world cafes and pro-action cafes and all in any manner of people getting together and talking and sharing in an authentic way their beliefs about the decisions that are important to them in their lives. So let's try to foster that. Let's try to foster the art of authentic conversations and Google Re-Demos.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we only have time for one more question. I know we have a line up there, so I'm going to... What a lady. Sabrina?
Good evening.
Be sure to ask we have a reception after this, and you can continue the conversation there. Sorry, go ahead.
I just have grown up in a rural community, and I've also worked in one. And I'm wondering, on when you have to make decisions about finances and environmental things, when you know that it's going to better, like perhaps densify an urban community, but you know it's going to hinder those in the urban community, and you consider those in the urban community, if you take away homes and such as an asset, and you just consider pure land, like the crops where your food comes from, and the trees that purify your air, and the things like that as your only asset, really those in the urban community, in the rural communities have the true assets. And how do you determine a decision that you know can greater those in the urban areas, which is your bulk of your people, and it might be an economically sound decision. For instance, biosolids, just an idea there. It's the Halifax, it was banned because the people stood up against it, but then council went against what the people said and came out with it. Basically, and it hinders those in the rural communities. And how do you decide on an ethical level that you have to go with what's the land and the environment saying and those in the rural communities versus your greater population in the urban areas?
I'm not sure if this is going to answer your question, but I'll throw it in anyway. Hopefully someone else will come up with a good answer. But this sounds odd, but I of all people, I read something by Preston Manning that relates to that. And people who know me will be surprised I'm saying that. But he was saying, here we are, we've got the second biggest land mass of any country in the world. We're almost the most urbanized country. We're in the top 2 or 3. Most people live in cities, and we've got this huge land mass. So he said, and the rural population is shrinking everywhere, and we know this. So he said, what about this rural population and this big land mass? Surely the people who live in those rural places are the stewards of that population. Surely they're the one, because that's where our wealth comes from. I work in Halifax, and I know that nobody actually makes anything in Halifax. There's hospitals, universities, government, the military. They don't actually go out at the end of November and bring lobsters out of that's rural people who do that. But it's not just the extraction of wealth, it's a special relationship to the land and place. And I think that's to me, that really struck a chord, that the people who live, no matter how few people live in those places, they have a very special role in our national or provincial well-being. And we should be recognizing that in green-collar jobs and so forth. And we should be saying, thank you, and we're going to support you to take care of our country or our province. Sorry to sermonize, but
I take a similar view. I think, you're talking about an urban-rural dynamic in this province. I think if you can lift it up another level and say, can we change the existing? It's not only political, but I'll use that term in a small p sense. Can we change the political dialectic of what's good for Halifax is not good for rural Nova Scotia and vice versa? So is there a way to construct a dialogue where we say, as Nova Scotians, we want solutions that work for us as a province, and we want solutions that work for the rural parts of the province, and we want solutions that work for the urban parts of the province. And we're not going to stop searching until we find solutions that are able to do both rather than have to choose between the one and the other. I agree with you completely. The existing dynamic is that binary choice. So in the same way that the argument that is made where growth and development in HRM is something actually that the province needs, is good for the province, but so is growth and development in the rural parts of the province, and both parts need to be concerned about the other. That's again why I think if you can lift it and get an umbrella hung over it, you'll actually get to different decisions.
Public policy, I think, can also be an important factor there, and I'm going to give you an immigration example. Most immigrants were going to Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, and the federal government with the provinces instituted a program called Provincial Nominee Programs. And that program has only been in effect for about 10 years now. What has happened is that the migration patterns have changed. So 50% of all of the immigrants who came to Canada 10 years ago went to Ontario, went to Toronto. Now more immigrants are going to Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and the Atlantic provinces than before. And if you take that policy and you extend it to Nova Scotia, we saw that 90% of all the immigrants who came to Nova Scotia settled in HRM. But with our provincial nominee program, now there's 70% settling in HRM. So your comment about stealing everybody is contrary to our policy in immigration. We are trying to encourage immigrants to select communities other than Halifax. The people that are interested in settling outside HRM tend to be artisans, writers, academics, people that can do their work no matter where they are in the world, but they are attracted to rural communities. We have a number of people who are interested in the open spaces, in environment, and even in isolation, doing their work in isolation. So policy programs can also affect this trend.
And if I could just add again to sort of a footnote to what Ray was saying about place, what you're talking about place, maybe this whole rural urban binary is actually a fiction, right? I mean, what is rural? Is Briar Island and Amherst, what do they have in common? We're bunching a whole bunch of things together. Why don't we just talk about place? Like the suburbs of Halifax are a whole new Nova Scotia. It looks totally different. And then there's all these successful towns like Truro and so forth that are actually very different from, drive a couple of hours. So maybe we should just be talking about people in communities and get away from this whole thing about cities and countryside and just look at people and places. And that might be a way.
All right. Andy, last word?
All right, thanks very much. So there's a guy named David Gordon who's the head of the director of the planning department at Queen's University, and he's been doing some amazing research that's going to get published very shortly. But in a nutshell, what it says is that we probably need to stop congratulating ourselves for being an urban country, for the majority of our residents living in urban areas. His research has shown that when you actually go and look in each of he did about 25 or 30 Canadian communities, where you're actually seeing is that the census metropolitan areas called cities actually include suburban areas. And that actually we're a suburban nation. So we're not living in the urban areas at all. We're living in the suburbs, which are extremely expensive to service and support, and are consumptive of land and energy, and harmful to public health and mental health in a lot of different ways. So let's just think about that for one sec. I have family and friends who live in Berwick and they're seeing, the farms closed. The farms are being turned under into subdivisions that are going to create an incredible debt problem for that town and many other towns like it in the very not too distant future. In the microcosm of HRM, in our own Prince Edward Island-sized municipality, we did a project called Capital Ideas, which was subtitled "Leveraging Urban Investment for Regional Prosperity." Leveraging urban investment for regional prosperity. So the idea was that you give the urban core every opportunity to succeed and become the economic engine for at least the municipality and maybe the province, and that's going to create the wealth that can help to keep farms open, to take away the economic reason that a farmer might sell his farm and build a subdivision instead. So I think I would like to see our discourse provincially move in that direction. Let's figure out how our existing communities existing larger communities can be densified and have their economies optimized in a way that can take the economic pressure off of suburbanization and allow rural areas to produce food and habitat rather than yet another subdivision.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you very much, panel. With that, and thank you, audience and online streamed-in audience, for participating tonight. The discussion, I think, was quite good, and I do believe that, for me at least, we've achieved the goal of beginning to chip away at this complex issue and coming up with even more questions that now we have to go off and research. I want to thank again the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs, Canadian Business Ethics Research Network, Acadia University, and Acadia University President's Office for supporting this event this evening. And I want to invite everybody in the live audience here to a reception that we'll be having upstairs in the garden room. I apologize to those students of mine who didn't get to ask a question, but y'all can come and talk to me, and the panel will be up there too, having some punch or cookies. But thank you very much for coming tonight.